We break into standard programming with an extraordinary, unprecedented report from deep behind the iron gates of Buckingham Palace, where an absolute seizure of royal authority has just been executed in total secrecy. The foundation of the centuries-old institution has fractured tonight, arriving without warning, ceremony, or room for appeal. In the suffocating, heavy silence of the king's private study, beneath the dim glow of antique lamps, King Charles sat alone. His hands, weathered by time and burdened by the weight of the realm, hovered over a crimson-bound file. Across the dimly lit room, his private secretary stood motionless, a silent witness to a historic execution of power. The document upon the mahogany desk was not a polite administrative note. It was a cold royal decree, a final order declaring that Meghan would no longer hold, claim, or publicly utter the title of the Duchess of Sussex. The dark ink on the parchment glistened in the shadow of the crown, yet the most terrifying detail of this silent coup was not the severity of the sanction itself. It was the handwritten, confidential recommendation attached to the margin, a shadowy, unyielding intervention from Princess Anne that had silently, ruthlessly crushed the king's paternal hesitation and transformed his agonizing doubt into absolute, unappealable action. Charles read the final paragraph twice, his eyes tracing the unforgiving words as if searching for a loophole that did not exist. His breath was shallow, his fingers trembling as they tightened around his golden fountain pen. To sign this parchment was to draw a line in the crimson dirt of royal history, severing his own blood, declaring to the world that the duty of the throne surpassed the love of a father. He understood the horrific price. He knew that Prince Harry would view this swift execution not as a constitutional necessity, but as a treacherous dagger plunged into the heart of his marriage, proof that the king had chosen the ruthless apparatus of the state over his youngest son. Yet, driven by the uncompromising shadow of his sister standing invisibly beside him, the monarch lowered the nib to the paper. The scratching sound of the pen echoed through the silent study like a death sentence. The ink settled. The crimson file was snapped shut. The sovereign had spoken, and the sentence was final. Thousands of miles away, across the dark expanse of the Pacific coast, the execution order arrived in Montecito under heavy security. The California night was still, suffocating in its quiet luxury, as Meghan received the sealed communication directly from her legal representatives. She took the pristine envelope calmly, her features composed into a mask of practiced indifference, expecting another minor administrative skirmish over commercial branding. But as her eyes moved across the formal black text, the color drained instantly from her face. She reached the critical sentence confirming the total removal of her ducal title and royal styling. Her hands shook violently. She pushed the paper away in sheer horror, then pulled it back, reading the words again and again, as though sheer force of will could rewrite the cold black ink. It could not. A wave of humiliation, fury, and disbelief crashed over her. The palace had not merely placed boundaries around her platform. It had used the supreme authority of the crown to decapitate her royal status, formally severing her from the institution she had spent years challenging. Buried deep within those formal legal structures lay the lethal blueprint crafted by Princess Anne. The Princess Royal's confidential memorandum had confronted the monarch with a devastating truth. This was no longer a petty family quarrel to be managed with soft words, but an existential battle over privilege, sacred duty, and institutional survival. Where Charles had desperately sought a soft compromise of temporary restrictions, Anne had delivered an unyielding mandate of total withdrawal. When Harry discovered that his sharp-minded aunt had secretly forged the language of their downfall, his grief turned into white-hot fury directed at both the king and the Princess Royal. Yet beneath that fury lay a far deeper, more terrifying wound. The realization that the aunt he had trusted above all others had personally orchestrated his wife's public execution. Behind this historic decree stood 4 figures bound by blood, yet irreconcilably divided by memory and betrayal. King Charles lived in terror of losing his son forever to the wilderness. Princess Anne was driven by a ruthless fear that the crown was bleeding to death through cowardly compromise. Prince Harry was consumed by the conviction that his wife was being systematically destroyed for demanding her freedom, and Meghan saw this ultimate act of authority as final proof that the fortress of the monarchy had never accepted her independence. What appeared to the world as a legal battle over an aristocratic title was in reality a dark, tragic collision of four warring loyalties and four completely different definitions of betrayal. To comprehend how this lethal trap closed around the royal family, one must look past the formal announcements and return to the shadowed halls of St. James's Palace months earlier. It was there, during the Commonwealth Legacy Memorial, a ceremony meticulously engineered to project absolute unity across a global realm, that suspicion hardened into irreversible certainty. Palace officials had issued clear, unequivocal instructions. Meghan was to be introduced strictly by her personal name. No titles, no royal styling. Yet, as the live broadcast flickered across secure screens in London, the announcer's voice echoed through the gallery, proclaiming the speaker as Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Sussex. In that single, calculated breath, a direct command from the sovereign was shattered on an international stage. Deep within the palace walls, Princess Anne watched the transmission in absolute silence. She did not flinch. She did not speak. Her face remained a carved mask of marble, while courtiers in the room froze, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the defiance. On screen, Meghan spoke eloquently of a new, compassionate form of global leadership operating beyond the rigid constraints of ancient institutions. To the public, it was an inspiring address. To the iron-willed inner circle of the crown, it was a declaration of ideological war delivered under the mantle of royal authority. When the broadcast concluded, Anne methodically closed her program, placed it upon the empty velvet chair beside her, and turned to her private secretary. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, devoid of passion or anger, as she asked a single question. Who had authorized that styling? The quietude of her tone carried more danger than an outburst of rage. By nightfall, the full extent of the defiance reached King Charles. Investigations revealed that palace officials had sent two separate, explicit written warnings demanding the removal of both the Her Royal Highness styling and the ducal title from the official recording. While the HRH had been quietly scrubbed from subsequent digital feeds, the title of the Duchess of Sussex had been deliberately retained. Charles did not explode in anger. Instead, he looked deeply, profoundly wounded. Another private compromise, forged in good faith to maintain family harmony, had been publicly weaponized against the crown. The monarch sat in his study, staring at the briefing papers, realizing that every concession he offered was being systematically transformed into a tool of public leverage. That very evening, in the dim solitude of her quarters, Princess Anne executed her countermove. She did not engage in emotional outbursts or family pleadings. Instead, she sat with her private secretary and recorded a formal, highly confidential memorandum. Her dictation was a masterpiece of cold, administrative warfare. She argued that voluntary agreements and informal gentlemen's understandings had definitively failed. The memorandum did not attack Meghan's character. It treated her actions as cold, forensic evidence of a structural threat to the crown. Anne documented every instance where royal styling had been used to challenge the monarchy's authority, concluding with a lethal recommendation: a formal constitutional review to strip non-working royals of titles used to undermine the sovereign. For agonizing weeks, King Charles held the lethal memorandum in his hands, terrified to act. He hoped against hope that silence and distance would cool the burning embers of the conflict. But the shadow of the memorial ceremony hung over every high-level palace meeting like an unexploded shell. Finally, driven to the brink by rising institutional pressure, the king requested a secure, encrypted video conference with Meghan. He sought one last, desperate attempt to save the title through direct negotiation. Princess Anne was invited to attend, but she flatly refused to enter the room. She told her brother that he must face his daughter-in-law without an audience or emotional distraction, unburdened by her presence, before she would deliver her final, binding recommendation. The confrontation that ensued across thousands of miles of ocean was meant to be a delicate exercise in diplomacy. Instead, it became a brutal, unscripted tragedy. Across the secure line, there were no press secretaries, no advisors, and no polished public relations facades. Only a father-in-law and a daughter-in-law facing each other across an inescapable void. Charles laid out his final offer, a delicate middle ground where Meghan could retain the Duchess of Sussex title socially within the family, but would be strictly barred from utilizing it in commercial ventures, media production, or political commentary. The king argued that title and privilege were inseparable from duty and restraint. But Meghan rejected the offer out of hand. Her voice trembling with intense emotion, she argued that the title was no longer a gift from the crown, but a core element of her children's heritage and her personal identity, an identity she insisted the palace was continuously trying to control and dismantle. As the argument intensified, the fragile decorum completely disintegrated. Charles, his patience thoroughly exhausted, removed his glasses and slammed them onto the desk, warning her that royal authority could not be claimed while rejecting royal obligation. At that explosive moment, Prince Harry, who had been waiting in the adjacent room, burst into the frame. Seeing his wife pushed to the brink, his anger boiled over. He confronted the king directly, demanding to know if Princess Anne was pulling the strings behind this ultimatum. Charles fell into a heavy, agonizing silence, a silence that confirmed Harry's worst suspicions. The call ended in bitter, irreparable ruin, leaving the king sitting in the quiet shadows, realizing that the last bridge of compromise had burned to ash. In the suffocating aftermath of the fractured video call, as the secure screens darkened into lifeless black, King Charles remained motionless at his mahogany desk, crushed under the realization that his final effort at familial compromise had dissolved into open war. Exhausted and emotionally battered, the monarch summoned Princess Anne to his private study. Midnight had long passed, and the ancient corridors of the palace were shrouded in an ominous, heavy silence. When the Princess Royal stepped through the oak doors, she carried no anger, no theatrical triumph, and no hollow words of consolation. In her hands rested a slim, crimson leather folder, the physical embodiment of months of confidential intelligence, constitutional precedent, and documented breaches of royal protocol. She set the file down precisely beside the king's unsigned draft. Charles looked up, his face etched with profound grief. "What remains possible now?" he asked softly, his voice barely audible above the ticking of the mantel clock. "If I strike this blow, I lose my son forever." Anne stood motionless beneath the looming portrait of their ancestors, her posture erect, her eyes reflecting the cold clarity of a strategist who had already accepted the ultimate cost. "You are not choosing to lose your son, Charles," she replied, her voice ringing with ice-cold authority. "You are choosing whether the crown retains any authority at all. A ducal title is not a personal heirloom or a commercial asset to be traded on global platforms. It is a public trust bestowed by the sovereign. When that trust is repeatedly weaponized to challenge the source of its own authority, silence is no longer patience. It is complete surrender." She unclasped the folder, exposing a meticulous ledger of events, from the unauthorized public styling at the Commonwealth Memorial to the defiant rejection of the video terms. It was an unassailable case that systematically dismantled every argument for further mercy. The psychological pressure inside the study reached a terrifying crescendo when the quiet was shattered by an urgent, direct telephone call from California. Prince Harry, having learned through trusted contacts that his aunt was in the study actively shaping the decree, demanded an immediate confrontation with the Princess Royal. Anne accepted the phone without hesitation, holding the receiver with unwavering composure as Harry's voice erupted across the ocean. The prince spoke with raw grief and white-hot fury, accusing his aunt of orchestrating a cold-blooded purge against his wife, of manipulating the king's paternal vulnerabilities, and of executing a campaign to strip them of their dignity. "You turned my father against us," Harry spat, his voice breaking with emotional devastation. "You forced him to destroy my wife's place in this family." Anne listened in complete silence, refusing to match his anger, her emotional control absolute. When his tirade finally faltered, she delivered a single truth that shattered the foundational assumptions of the Sussex camp. "Your father was not turned, Harry. she said, her tone terrifyingly quiet yet heavy as iron. He was finally forced to decide. You demanded the supreme privileges of this crown, while utterly rejecting every obligation and authority that sustains it. Familial affection cannot be weaponized to hold an ancient institution hostage. The absolute certainty in her voice severed the line in spirit long before the call ended. Across the globe, in the darkness of Montecito, Harry felt the ground beneath him give way completely. The belief that his father would always yield to public pressure was instantly destroyed, replaced by the crushing realization that the iron gates of the palace had officially locked forever. Inside the study, as the silence returned, Prince William's confidential concurrence arrived through secure palace channels, finalizing the total shift of power. The Prince of Wales stood in full agreement with his aunt. Royal authority must be protected without exception. King Charles found himself completely surrounded by the consensus of his crown. The father yielded to the sovereign. With trembling fingers, Charles reached for his fountain pen. He drew a bold, crimson line through the paragraph offering temporary commercial restrictions, and in his own firm handwriting, penned the definitive mandate: full, absolute, and permanent withdrawal of the Duchess of Sussex title from Meghan. As the heavy ink settled into the parchment, the balance of power shifted forever, leaving a family broken, a line drawn, and the absolute authority of the monarchy reasserted over the shattered remnants of personal devotion. When the sun rose over London the following morning, it illuminated a world permanently altered by the ink of a single signature. The formal announcement, pinned to the iron gates of Buckingham Palace and distributed across global news wires, was deceptively short. A handful of clinical, administrative sentences confirming that Meghan would no longer hold or publicly use the title of Duchess of Sussex. To the public, it appeared as a swift protocol adjustment, but behind the heavy velvet drapes of the royal residence, the atmosphere was thick with the suffocating dust of a devastating war. The storm had passed, leaving in its wake an eerie, uncomfortable silence. In the sun-drenched estates of Montecito, the frenetic energy of legal challenges and media strategy meetings suddenly collapsed into absolute stillness. The realization settled in like a cold frost. The battle was over, the decision was irreversible, and the supreme authority of the British Crown had reasserted its unyielding boundary. The losing side had not merely suffered a tactical setback, they had been systematically disarmed, stripped of the very royal authority that had anchored their global platform, leaving them stranded in a cold, unfamiliar reality beyond the fortress walls. For Meghan and Harry, this new reality brought a profound, fatalistic weight. The title had never been a simple decorative honorific. It was the sacred key that opened the highest doors of global influence, the gilded shield that protected their narrative, and the ultimate currency that sustained their multi-million-dollar media endeavors. Deprived of that royal mantle, the foundation of their power disintegrated. In the quiet halls of their California sanctuary, the dynamic shifted from defiance to a heavy, inescapable loss. Without the Crown's endorsement, their proclamations of independent leadership lost their royal gravity, exposing the stark truth that their influence had always flowed from the ancient institution they had sought to reform. The advisors departed, the legal teams folded their briefs, and the couple was left to face the terrifying prospect of building a future where they were no longer royal representatives, but ordinary private citizens stripped of the sovereign aura that had once elevated them above the rest of the world. Yet, inside the ancient stone walls of Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, the victors found no joy, no celebration, and no relief in their triumph. King Charles sat in the quiet vastness of his private quarters, staring at the empty space on his desk where the crimson file had rested. The monarch had saved the institutional credibility of the throne, but at the horrific price of severing the final thread connecting him to his younger son. Every step through the historic corridors now felt heavier, loaded with the tragic realization that his reign would forever be marked by the exile of his own blood. For Prince William, the burden of leadership grew exponentially darker. Standing beside his father, the heir recognized the cold, unforgiving nature of the crown he would one day inherit. He saw clearly that royal duty demands total subjugation of personal feelings, and that protecting the continuity of the monarchy requires a willingness to sacrifice even those closest to you. In the background of this historic purge stood Princess Anne, quietly returning to the relentless rhythm of her royal duties without seeking praise, credit, or recognition. She had acted not out of malice or personal vendetta, but as the relentless guardian of an ancient covenant. She understood what history has proven time and again, that the crown survives only when its boundaries are absolute and its authority remains untouchable. The loss of power by those who challenged it was not a tragedy of chance, but the inevitable consequence of standing against a multi-century apparatus built to endure at all costs. The illusion of modern compromise had been shattered, replaced by the grim reality that inside the realm of sovereign power, loyalty is absolute, duty is non-negotiable, and those who attempt to weaponize the crown against itself will ultimately be crushed beneath the weight of its history. This dark episode stands as a chilling testament to the eternal nature of the British monarchy, an ancient machine that has swallowed kings, exiled princes, and erased titles across 1,000 years of blood and tradition. From the bloody purges of the Tudor court to the quiet, devastating exiles of the modern era, the lesson of history remains brutally constant. The individual is temporary, but the crown is eternal. Empires fall, political movements crumble, and personal ambitions wither. Yet the throne stands immutable, indifferent to the tears of fathers or the fury of disgraced royals. As the dust settles over this historic shift, the world is left to contemplate a sovereign power that demands total devotion and forgives no betrayal. If you felt the chilling gravity and deep intrigue of this historic power shift, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more unvarnished, behind-the-scenes deep dives into the shadowed halls of global royalty.